No, this is an excellent question. Let me start like from my narrow perspective as somebody who works on inequality, on income inequality. The situation becomes even more difficult with unrealized capital gains. And just like make a comparison, unrealized capital gain on stocks that you have or wealth that you hold in like mutual fund or something like that. It's very similar to the painting that you have in your room, whose value, for some reason, such a painter became now much more popular than before. The value has gone up. But has anything changed in reality? Yes, your wealth has changed in the case you wanted to sell that painting or you wanted to sell the stock that you have. But actually, otherwise, nothing has really changed. So I'm really somewhat reluctant on sort of going big time on.
All right. Thank you so much, Branko, for joining Expanding Horizons. It's really great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a little bit difficult to set it up all on video to work between the different time zones and technical problems, but I'm very glad that we are here now.
Yeah. Thank you for making that effort. I want to start off by asking the hot topic that everyone is talking about, which is artificial intelligence. So typically, whenever there's technological changes, you have some winners and losers. But this time, there's a different conversation where many people are saying this is a very different technological transition from prior technology. So, do you think AI is a very different technological change this time, or is it like any other technological change?
This is really a difficult question and also an easy question. It's a difficult because we try to actually understand something which will happen in the future and we make analogies with the past. It's easy in the sense that objectively nobody knows. So we can be all equally wrong. Now, let me explain what is my current thinking on that. My previous thinking was that I saw it as a technological change like any other over the last 200 years. It's essentially you replace labor, sometimes skilled labor, sometimes unskilled labor, but you replace it with capital. And of course, artificial intelligence is capital. We are used to seeing capital as a machine, but artificial intelligence is also a machine that you might not see in a physical sense, the way that you see, like, for example, a construction engine, but it's the same idea. However, I think that there is now, and that's why I've changed a little bit my mind, there is now something new. And that something new is the ability of the machine to reinvent itself. So that's something that we did not have before. In other words, artificial intelligence, if it becomes, and it might become, what people sort of think now, is not simply going to do what, for example, I've used it a little bit on the internet, collect information and put it in a way that you can read and maybe summarize and so on. It would actually learn and have agency. And actually, when the machines have agency, I think then the situation changes. Then it really almost becomes very difficult to put it exactly where it belongs because it could become labor. So let us suppose that that artificial intelligence has this agency, that it starts doing things that you and I are doing now, and then you do have a big change in the sense that even if you look from the point of view of factors of production, it could become laborer. It's no longer a tool, because a tool is always sort of used by a laborer and the laborer says to the tool what to do. But in this case, the tool will become the laborer. So that's why I think it is new. And I am not very much into big hypes, but when I think of this, I do think that it is a significant change, a new change, something that we have never experienced before.
And what do you think are the implications of this, in particular, like for emerging countries like India? Typically, the path was by these developing countries would offer cheap labor, and this would help it climb the ladder. And now, this development ladder, do you think it changes with AI and robotics moving that cost advantage?
This is, of course, one way of looking at it, but let me continue what I was saying before. Let us think of this as really transformative technology. And if you think of that like that, then you're no longer simply thinking, okay, well, this machine might replace labor that, for example, now is working in India and it's linked to the international labor. It might replace this particular people by machines. But one has to start to thinking that actually it is such a quantum leap that actually developing countries have an advantage in the sense that everybody starts more or less from the same position. So in other words, the technological changes we have seen now is really driven by maybe three countries, US, China, and India. And each of them is really basically at a very similar level of development. So in that sense, I would see it as a big opportunity for well-educated and also countries that can actually are able to apply that, not only to catch up in the usual sense, but really do what, for example, China has clearly done. It's no longer catching up. It's actually pushing the frontier. So I'm in that sense also optimistic. As I said, I don't think we have to think of this only simply within the current confines, whether it would replace somebody, like whether taxi drivers would be replaced by autonomous cars. We have to really think of this as possible, really big change. Even if you look at Africa, Africa would always start with a clean slate in that sense. And Africa would have an advantage that it has many, like India, many young people who have shown themselves to be much better, including myself, who had actually had support from my son in order to start this conversation. So that's the advantage.
So, do you consider AI as a transformative force that will create new jobs?
I don't know. There obviously, there is always talk that it would replace people, like I mentioned before, taxi drivers. It can replace cleaners. We can replace waiters. I've seen, of course, robots that actually deliver food. It can replace professors. It can, because you basically can have autonomous professor who is going to tell you more or less the same thing that I'm telling the students. It would, and people, of course, said that actually it would replace, that was rather obvious, legal offices, junior clerks who write things basically summarizing the previous cases. It might also replace people in medical professions. But I think, like every other technology, it would create also new jobs that we cannot imagine now. And I'm quoting, for example, many years ago, Nassim Taleb wrote it very nicely. He says, if you're like a Stone Age expert and your tribal chief asks you to tell him what would be the new technologies that would be developed, if you knew what were the new technologies, you would have already developed them. So, we cannot in advance know what would be new technologies and new jobs that would appear, this particular development would require. I remember when computers and PCs became prevalent, we couldn't imagine like what kind of jobs they would create, and they did create quite a lot of other jobs of people, including the people who are, obviously like servicing the computers, others who are doing architectural design and so on. So we don't know for the artificial intelligence either. But just to finish this long answer, let me just say that the part which I think is very difficult to predict is that transformative nature of artificial intelligence itself, when it becomes a new labor. And that's something that I think is totally new.
Understood. Do you have views on AI governance or redistribution? There are some people who talk about universal basic income or taxing AI generated profits or having some data dividends. Do you have any views on how redistribution will look like in this more AI enhanced world?
I would be very much against taxing specifically things that have to do with artificial intelligence, in the sense that if you make lots of money out of artificial intelligence, you should be taxed differently than other people. I don't think it makes sense. I think it is actually then directly opposed to technological progress. And I don't think that we should be opposed to technological progress. But if people become billionaires thanks to the artificial intelligence and these developments, they should be treated like other billionaires. And I do actually think that in many cases, billionaire tax or a tax on really extraordinary high wealth is something that should be done. So whether wealth is made because you did it in real estate or casinos or Miss Universe, as Trump did, or you did it in artificial intelligence, I think you should be treated the same.
On that billionaire point, so a large part of income sits in unrealized capital gains. And it's always been a tricky aspect for governments to tax it. So do you have any thoughts on or ideas around this? How are we going to tax these billionaires if all of this is sitting in unrealized capital assets?
No, this is an excellent question. Let me start from my narrow perspective of somebody who works on inequality, on income inequality. I don't work that much on wealth inequality, but on income. unrealized, first, we have a problem with realized capital gains because they're really not part of income. They are part of your increased of wealth. Your wealth is what is called like below the line. So we look at the flows. The flow is income and wealth is below the line. And even realized capital gain is something which increases your wealth. It's not a flow. But the situation becomes even more difficult with unrealized capital gains. And just like make a comparison, unrealized capital gain on stocks that you have or wealth that you hold in like mutual fund or something like that is very similar to the painting that you have in your room, whose value for some reason, such a painter became now much more popular than before. The value has gone up. But has anything changed in reality? Yes, your wealth has changed in the case you wanted to sell that painting or you wanted to sell the stock that you have. But actually, otherwise, nothing has really changed. So I'm really somewhat reluctant on sort of going big time on unrealized capital gains because they neither increase the consumption of people who are actually having them, and they don't. And if you believe that there is some type of consumption that is ostentatious or ostentatory and that you would like actually to limit, this doesn't come into that play. They are difficult issue both from the point of view of accounting and from the point of view of taxation. But I'm not, in some sense, you can actually even see in a very Marxist or Ricardian way, unrealized capital gains is a kind of, how should I say, it is a kind of homage paid by the rich to development. In other words, if they are always unrealized, they would be permanently fueling investments. And in that sense, this is something that also you don't want to discourage.
So how does that look like practically? Does that, like, for example, if I hold a capital asset for X number of years and there is a large unrealized gain on it, will that have to like now be taxed? So will I need to liquidate that? Is that something that's feasible?
But the problem becomes, I think, actually, I'm not a tax expert, but I think the problem starts and becomes a problem when either you want to liquidate, to sort of basically take into cash or to realize the shares that you owned or the painting that you owned, or you want to actually give it to somebody, to your family, to your sons or others. At that point, I think you have to tax it because it becomes then realized and you have to tax it. But taxing it before coming to that point, I really do not see exactly the purpose of that. Because as I was said before, it is not increasing consumption in an ostentatory way. It is essentially like the painting that you keep on your wall. Moreover, it is a productive capital, so it is actually used permanently to roll up and to actually invest. So we have the situation, Keynes in the opening paragraphs of the economic consequences of the piece wrote, somewhat idealized view of Europe before 1914. And he said the system was very unequal or inequitable, but it maintained itself because the assumption was that the rich people would actually mostly use the money that they have made to do investments. And in reality, if you have rich people who practically do that all the time, that it is not that much of a problem until it is withdrawn and it is inherited by somebody. At that point, yes, I think it needs to be taxed.
You've also mentioned and written about the birthplace lottery, where like wherever you're born, there is a premium finding. So I would like to also push back slightly and say, like in the current world, there are like expanding pathways. You can have a global education, digital economies, social media. It's actually quite easier to jump across distribution curves compared to like a generation ago. So do you see this birthplace lottery premium sort of diminishing, going down as the years are progressing?
No, I do see it. Actually, what you're saying exactly, it is true. And that's another technological change which was accelerated, as you know, by COVID. We had before COVID also the ability to use online, basically, jobs to have them, but they're relatively few. And then COVID really pushed us in that direction. Technically, yes, it is true that actually if one were to move further and further in that direction, which can happen, you really don't need to be physically in one country and not another country. You can do the same job and be paid exactly the same and so forth. And actually, even if you can say you're in a poorer country and the price level in that country is lower, you can actually have in real terms a higher salary there than you would have it elsewhere. But my point was more general. It was not only about the labor market, that the point that you made, but it's also the very fact that there are still huge differences in income levels between the countries. Just to illustrate that, you can take the median income of a person in Tanzania, and you have a median income of a person in Norway, and the ratio is probably, I don't know offhand, but it's probably more than 10. And this is really the citizenship premium, because you could have exactly the same person uh, driving a bus, in Kampala, and the person in Uppsala, and they would have a different wage. So that was the premium. And moreover, what I actually meant, which I think is an interesting point, and maybe I should have elaborated it more, is that premium, of course, depends on the bilateral comparison between the countries, but it also depends on where you expect to end up in the income distribution of the rich country. Because if you, for example, going back to the example of Tanzania, if you expect that you're going to be in a lower part of the distribution of a rich country to which you migrate, then for you it's better to go to a country like Sweden than to a country like the US. But if you expect the opposite, if you expect actually that you're fairly highly qualified, you actually like to go to a country with very high inequality, because you expect to end up in the top of the income distribution there. So the premium itself, and that's my last point, is not simply one number. It is a number depending on where you're in income distribution of the emitting country and where you expect to be in income distribution of the receiving country. And in function of that, you can actually, it varies along the income distribution.
Got it. Going back to the taxation point, sorry. There's also data that shows, like, that the top 1% of some countries, they are paying more taxes, let's say 30, 50 years ago, relative to the bottom 50%. I think this is true in US especially.
Yeah,
Do
sure.
you feel like the top 1% should be taxed more? Or would that, like, push the top earners elsewhere and stifle innovation? For example, in California, they're talking about the billionaire tax, and in New York City also they were talking about some taxes. So does that create like this incentive to go away from these places to, like, perhaps Dubai or somewhere there, like, lower taxes? Will it backfire?
Yes, it does. But let me, sort of divide your question in two parts. First question: is it true that really people at the top of the income distribution? I'm talking about income distribution, not wealth. Wealth distribution is even more unequal, and I think it's more inequitable also in terms of taxation. But let's stay with income. Is it true that they are paying less than they used to pay? First, yes, generally true, because of course the top marginal rates were much higher before than they are now. Although it has to be said that actually these top marginal rates that used to be 90% really covered a very small number of people. But I think they do pay now less. That was the argument that Zuckman and Sayes made. I think that they are right. They pay less. But what is even more sort of striking, and that's my second point, is that they argue, and they show that the average tax rate and that particular range, which is really like top 1%, or 2 at most, is lower than the average tax rate that is paid, for example, of people who are at the top decile. So also rich people, but not as rich as the top 1%. So then we have really a paradoxical situation that the progressivity of the system, like the American system, is really working well up to 98 or 99 percentile, because the average rate is higher for richer people. Not only marginal, but the average. But then you come to the top, and then suddenly for the top, you have a reversal that the average rate goes down. And then clearly the system does not maintain progressivity throughout. So I believe, in their findings, I have to say that in the household surveys, you do not find that, but you do not find that decrease in progressivity. You find basically flat progress, like flat rate towards the end, but in part because taxation, part of the direct taxation in household surveys is imputed, not actually taxation that is paid, for which IRS has the data. In household surveys, it is imputed. So obviously, if these people at the top have really shenanigans to hide their income, or to pretend to put them in different trusts, or actually to use corporate taxes instead of personal, I think there is an overestimation of how much they're paying. I'm not sure if I made this correct, but what I'm going to say is that I think that towards the end of the income distribution, on the top of the income distribution in the US, you do not have progressivity anymore, but you have regressivity, because the average tax rate at the top is smaller than the average tax rate for the previous percentiles.
And the second part of the question, in terms of like it creates the wrong incentives and it would push people elsewhere. What do you think around that?
Yes, yes. I'm sorry, I forgot the second part. Yes, they are talking a lot, and actually, as you know, in the United States, there is also struggle between state taxations, and people move, for example, from California, they move to Texas, they move to Kentucky, where state tax is zero, and it's not negligible, because basically you have in high tax states you pay something, two-digit number, maybe it is 10%, 12%, and in no tax states you pay zero. So there is a movement within the United States. Now, whether that movement is significant worldwide, well, we have seen, like, for example, now with Dubai, there was lots of talk about, of course, people from England in particular, for the US and so on, Russia, China, they go to Dubai, and that was really tax haven. But we have seen sort of problems now with the war. I'm not totally convinced that that problem is huge, but maybe I'm wrong on that, because if we combine the tax jurisdictional incentives that we talk about with what you said before, ability to do your job from whenever you are in the world, yes, I could see the advantage that some people would really sort of see by moving to places that are really tax havens, like Dubai.
I also want to ask about the political landscape. In capitalism alone, you had, I think, described two models. Recently, though, we are seeing a shift away from a liberal meritocratic capitalism towards like this populist surge. So, do you see the models that you described change with this new wave of populism that's coming in the West?
Yes, I think actually when I wrote the book, obviously the book is couched in the way of liberal meritocratic capitalism. By meritocratic, I didn't mean that there's something meritocratic in the sense that people get what they deserve. Meritocratic is self-perception. It does not mean necessarily reality. So liberal capitalism and political capitalism. I think the term political capitalism, as I said, actually comes from Max Weber, and I think that China fitted that model quite well, and it continues to fit that model. However, in the meantime, as you said, I think that we have seen other examples of political capitalism, which are not maybe as clear-cut as China is, but India definitely has moved in that direction. Russia is obviously there. Turkey has moved. And I don't want to use that in a pejorative way. And obviously, United States, you can say, under Trump has moved there. I just see it as a different way of how should I say, different way of managing, regulating a polity. So I don't, in the book, try to avoid that value judgment, one is good, another is bad. There are certain advantages. And if you look at all these countries that I mentioned, well, not all, but most of them, people forget that for example, for Turkey had the highest growth rate among the rich countries. It has now, for the first time in history, overtaken in GDP per capita Greece. That has never happened before, and has really created a very significant middle class. So when we speak of Erdogan, we tend to forget that there are actually indeed, many people who vote for him. And likewise for Modi in India. So, we should not simply say, this is a system that somehow is flawed. It has certain features that we might not like, but on the other hand, it is able to deliver economic growth.
Another book of yours, I think, is a popular thing is the elephant curve. It became quite popular. I want to ask surrounding that, like the bottom 50%, some would argue live better in absolute terms compared to the bottom 50% of, let's say, 100 years ago. So should we be measuring quality of life across time and not just at a single point of time? Is relative frame across time something important that sort of gets missed?
No, I totally agree. We should be doing that. And actually, we are doing that. The issue there is the following. I worked on economic history actually on that particular topic by looking at the 19th century data. Now, for the 19th century, and we're trying now to really do much more than before, for 19th century, we have reasonably good estimates of the GDP per capita. You can actually disagree with the Madison data, and Madison project is revising them. What we do not have is we really have very, very poor data on income distribution by large countries. So this is where there is, I think, a push now. I think at most, I think we might have some estimates for about a dozen countries and maybe only 2 or 3 points in time. As we get more data, I think that the comparisons will become more common. But there is no doubt, even if you take only the GDP per capita as the mean and then impose any kind of distribution to that mean, let's suppose you take some seems reasonable distribution, you will still find that person who were the median at that point, let's suppose a person who was a median in India in 1850 and a person at the median today, obviously they would differ in real terms enormously. So yes, we have had a huge increase in mean income in the world. There is this chart which is sort of like a hockey stick. That it is true actually when you look at the mean, for example, GDP per capita in the world then and now, you obtain exactly that result. So yes, we should actually do much more of that, but we are limited by data.
Fair point. Do you think societies should focus more on growth, innovation, technological progress, or should it be inequality? Because some would argue that focusing in on inequality could be a distraction, whereas growth, innovation, technological progress, these sort of lifts all boats and it creates more redistribution than some other redistribution program would. So what are your thoughts on this in terms of how growth versus inequality is balanced and with that?
I mean, an easy answer to that, but that's easy answer in words, but it's difficult to implement, is that we should focus on inequalities that are bad, pernicious, or for growth. In other words, there are inequalities clearly that are bad for growth. For example, if you take inequality, which is essentially due to the background, to the parental background, ability to sort of use the system to your advantage, nepotistic stuff, this is clearly bad for growth because you end up with on the top and you end up with people who actually draw all that income and wealth from the parental connections. So I not mean only connections, but parental background. So this is an inequality which is bad for growth. And I think that's where health and education accessible to all is absolutely crucial. If you don't have education that is actually almost, it will never be the same, but almost equally accessible for somebody who is poor as for somebody who is rich, then you really have there an inequality which is inimical to growth. Likewise for health. Health is so important because obviously if you're poor and you cannot afford health, then you cannot even work. So it's also bad. But there are also inequalities, I believe, that may be necessary for growth because you have to have differences in income or wages for people who are contributing more or who are working more, or in some cases who are lucky. There is a luck is strong element. So basically, as we have from John Romer, you have circumstances for which you should really control, and you have effort, which should give you higher income, and then you have luck. And luck is that random element. He has a very nice name for it. John Romer calls it episodic luck because it is really sort of something that no society and nobody can control. Sometimes just are lucky that demand for your job is high now, or unlucky that suddenly it is not strong demand. But as I said, there are inequalities that are inimical for growth, and I think they should be, particularly inequalities due to the background, and they should be controlled.
So you would argue that there is some level of inequality that is probably needed for to create an engine of ambition, for risk taking, for entrepreneurship, that gives that motivation and that risk taking, right? It's not just, it goes both ways.
Absolutely, it goes both ways. And I would agree. For example, originally, if you look at Chinese experience, Xi Jinping became. I'm sorry, when Deng Xiaoping became the paramount leader, or as you know, he was never more than technically he was only, I think, a vice premier. But when he became important, Deng Xiaoping, this approach of increasing incentives and actually making people who are working harder invest or maybe have innovation or whatever, the responsibility system in the countryside, it really transformed China. Now the question is actually, at what point do you have to have some sort of, how should I say, control over enormous fortunes that might have been made, which then might be used to have a political role. So this is the issue. I don't think there is any doubt that China, for example, in 1978, really needed incentives in order to get ahead. But the question is, for example, now, should you now really be tougher on people who are making money maybe through monopoly position other way? So it's always there is no one answer. There is no one Gini coefficient that you want to have. It is, I think, always contingent on the situation.
Because in past, sometimes creating equal systems have not always worked. They have not entirely worked. There has to be sometimes, not everybody can always.
I totally agree. Actually, if you look at the socialist experience, it's an example of that. There was for example, equalization, very strong attempt to reduce differences between skilled and unskilled labor. In part, it was ideological because it was considered to be dictatorship of the proletariat, which was then translated as sort of a quote unquote dictatorship of the low skilled workers. And the differences were reduced. Now, if you reduce such differences, obviously there is less incentive for people to work hard or to actually study. And there is then a general incentive really to work much less. And in order to become prosperous and rich, fortunately, that's the fact. One has to work. And if you want people to work, you have to pay them more when they're working harder than when they don't. It's like with students, if you just give A to everybody, well, the ultimate result would be that, of course, people who normally would actually study hard, they would actually stop studying hard. I mean, this is like very elementary logic, but it is true.
I also wanted to ask you about what it was like growing up in Yugoslavia. Like, what did your early life teach you about economic systems, how wealth got distributed? Like, what did your early life, how did it impact you economically, and how did it shape your career?
No, you're basically asking about what is being studied at university and how it was. Is it basically the
Yeah, I
idea?
mean your life experience when you were at Yugoslavia, and how did it shape you in any particular way? Was it through education or some experiences that you had? Like, how did your early life get shaped from staying in Yugoslavia? Because it's different. When you live in a country, you have all these different experiences, and it shapes your thinking. So I just wanted to know your experience.
Well, there are several elements there. First, in terms of studies, I studied economics, but then actually at some point you have to decide whether you want to study like more like macro or trade and so on. I went into statistics and mathematics. It was actually called statistics and cybernetics in those days. And one of the big things was really statistics and statistical distributions and so on, but with no application to anything. So we would just study all these distributions. We will find the first moment, second moment, I cannot now remember, generalized distributions and so on. And then since I was always interested in the social aspect of things, I then discovered essentially by myself, look, what I can do is there are distributions of income. And I remember the first distribution that I ever seen was a French distribution. It was published in a newspaper. So I said, well, this looks like we can just chart it as the distributions that we normally use in class, I don't know, like high square. Of course, I didn't know about log normal distribution then. So that basically, to some extent, determined my rest of my life, because that was when I discovered that the tools of mathematics and statistics really can be used for something which I found important or useful. And but as I said, it was the how should I say, the beginning of my interest there. I even had friends who called me, because then I discovered the Gini coefficient. None of that was actually studied in school, at university, because we didn't study that. Like, that was not different from the United States or England, because income distribution was really studied, and I know that later when I came to the US, was studied only in the context of developing countries. So practically, if you look at Samuelson, wrote about that in Visions of Inequality. Samuelson talks a lot about wage determination, and has a big chapter about capital, marginal productivity of capital, and how interest and profit are determined. But there is no income distribution. Income distribution appears in the last part of the famous economics in, I think, 3 or 4 pages, when he starts talking about developing countries. So it was really almost assumed that income distribution in rich countries really is solved. Likewise, in socialism, and then just when you're answering your question, it was essentially assumed that income distribution was as it should be. So let's not study it too much. Let's not do very much with it, because whatever it is, it's how it should be. So it's really an a priori view that income distribution in socialism is really how the good income distribution should be. And when I did my dissertation on income distribution in Yugoslavia, it was 1987. The dissertation was accepted. There was no problem and all that. But the topic was called, as they called it in those days, sensitive topic, depending on what you find out that maybe some people would not like.
Very interesting. And were there any early thinkers, books, authors that influenced you?
Well, of course, many people influenced me. Then, when we speak of Yugoslavia, was very much influenced by very important economists. Has first name like me, but that's not the reason. Branko Horvat, who actually originally was working a lot on empirical studies on socialist economies, in particular Yugoslavia, because there was also cycles there, and we call them investment cycles. So you would have actually government and basically starting to invest quite a lot, and then they would hit sort of a constraint, budget constraint, or the efficiency of investments would be low. So then you would have the other part, which would be sort of the downward part of the cycle. So Horvath did quite a lot of work on that, and then he became more interested in studying more generally socialist systems as class-based systems, and that was actually a very big step forward. He was using Marxist analysis to actually argue that socialist systems are also class systems, where really the upper class or the ruling class are the people who are controlling the government. So his argument was that if you apply Marxist analysis creatively, it doesn't mean that you always, let's suppose, in landowning societies, the dominant class is determined by the ownership of land. In societies of capitalist modern world, is determined by the ownership of financial and physical capital. In socialism, is determined by the control of the state. So that actually influenced me quite a lot. He was not the only one. There were, of course, previous works which were done in the same vein, but sometimes they were, relatively. His work, I think, was more sophisticated. It was done much later. And then there are other people, like, for example, János Kornai, whom I read actually in those days, who actually studied socialist economies beautifully. I think that he was for socialism what Keynes was for capitalism. And of course, other authors, like, for example, I started reading Marx when I was quite young, and I always found Marx super interesting to read. You don't need to read Marx from page 1 of Das Kapital. You can just go to the third volume, which I think is really excellent, and which deals with all the real events in capitalist system, very much similar to what you can sort of observe today.
Who do you think are the most prominent economists, more on the left-leaning sides, that are, relevant and prominent today?
Well, this is really a difficult question. Actually, I cannot even tell you offhand, because, of course, some of them are. I remember, when I read them, but there are really quite a lot of people now. It is. It just comes to mind. I'm reading more of a sort of political economy stuff more now than what is considered economics alone. For obvious reasons, okay, obviously, for when you ask me about income distribution, I would definitely say Piketty, and then, of course, Saez and Zuckman, Lucas Chancel, all the Paris school. But then I think also from economic historians, there are lots of much younger historians, like I know quite a lot of them, like Javier Rodriguez Weber, for example, Diego Castaneda, Philip Erfurt. They are really, Guido Alfani. So there is really a lot of younger, well, they're not like kids anymore, but they are younger, maybe your age or so, economic historians who are actually empirically minded. And the group that I mentioned before, which is with Paris School of Economics. And of course, older people like Samuel Bowles, who have been working on income distribution for a long time.
Yeah. One final question. What do you think the world would look like in 10 years, 50 years, and 100 years in terms of equality? Do you think wealth will distribute? Are we heading towards a more equal or a less equal global world? across these time frames?
And let me, before I answer that, let me just also mention, when I spoke about political economy, also several really excellent economists like Isabella Weber, who actually did work on China, Clara Mattei, who did work on Mussolini, Italy, and so on. So these are just to complete not to complete, but because the list could go on much further, but just to mention them as well. How the world would look, I can tell you now what we have the most recent results, if you will, between 1990 or late 90s and 2023. My last numbers are 2023. There was a decline in global income inequality driven essentially by China, but not only by China, because also India played quite a big role there. Now the situation is as follows. China is no longer the engine of global inequality reduction because it has become sufficiently rich that when it grows fast, it creates as much of a gap with large countries, particularly in Africa, that are not growing, like, for example, like Congo, Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, Nigeria. And it is coming closer to the Western countries, big countries like the US or Japan or Germany. But the two effects really sort of cancel each out, and even the effect of China being further apart from what are the poorer countries is adding to global inequality. Well, that means that really the onus, if we are talking about reduction of global inequality, is India and especially African countries. Now, the African countries are very special because if you take 8 countries, which are about 100 million people, and they are growing, that's where the population is growing. So to answer your question, I would say I don't know which way it would go, but one thing I think we can, with more or less certainty, say, a lot of the reduction of global inequality would really depend on growth rates of large African countries. And I hate to say Africa as a whole, because it's not one country, it's 55 countries, but we have really to focus on about 7 or 8 countries that are now around 100 million people each, but they would become 200 soon. So, that would be the answer. So the convergence of Africa is absolutely a sine qua non, both for the reduction of global poverty, for the equalization of incomes around the world, and maybe for also spreading of economic activity much more equally than it is now. So I think our attention should really, people who work with global numbers should be really focused there now much more than on China.
And do you think Africa is heading in that direction? Are you positive, optimistic on Africa's direction, or do you still feel like there's more work or policies that are needed?
If I look at the past, I'm not optimistic on Africa because I looked actually at the numbers, and I think they are in my either in a paper or in my new book, The Great Global Transformation. If you look at Africa from 1960 to today and compare the growth rates of the countries in Africa with Asia, and not only simply what is the growth rate over the time, but look at the sustained growth. And I had like a sort of a minimal requirement. Can you have 5 years of growth of 5% per capita, okay, but sustained for 5 years? What you find is that there are very few cases in Africa. The only large country that did that was Ethiopia in Africa, and it was after it recovered from the civil war and famine and misrule by Mengistu and so on. And if you look at Asia, you have like 24 countries, and you have the episodes like in the case of China, which lasted 30 years, in case of Japan, 25 years, Korea, and so forth. So there was like really total difference in experiences. But that does not mean that it has to be like that in this century. And that's where, when going back to your original question, when we discuss the role of new technologies and artificial intelligence, I think what we see there is that when it comes to the absorption or acceptance of new technologies, Africa doesn't have the gap that it does have in some other areas. Africa is not producing cars, it's not producing airplanes, so there is clearly a gap there. But when it comes to new technology, that gap is much smaller. So that's where I see the transformative nature of new technologies, that they might actually help countries that normally, if we didn't have that technology, they would have to go through all the steps. They would have to go through, production of water bottles to production of airplanes. But if you can go for entirely new technology, you are not as disadvantaged compared to the others, to the rich people, as you would be otherwise. So that's my optimistic take.
Thank you so much, Branko, for joining and sharing your views. It was really nice having you on the show.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. I really appreciate your questions on artificial intelligence because I have only started thinking about that more recently, And as I said before, I've changed my opinion because originally I thought it would be essentially like another technological development, like going back to Ricardo, when he has a chapter about displacement of labor. But now I think it is something that we have not experienced before.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, one final question, if you don't mind. Have you personally used any of these artificial intelligence models, and like, have you been able to get your hands on it? Because it's a little hard to access if you're not a little technologically savvy.
No, I've only used really the most elementary things where you first don't have to pay, and secondly, I use it essentially as an improved version of Google because it's essentially summarizing what you ask some questions. You can ask a real question now compared to Google, so it is an improvement. But I've seen actually people use it. For example, I was doing a joint paper with somebody, and it was the artificial intelligence that figured out that we had a mistake in number for one country. So it basically highlighted to us, to him actually, he was using it, highlighted sort of illogical thing about the numbers, and then of course we obviously then spotted the mistake. So I've seen that possibility. I also have to say, okay, maybe it's an interesting topic where to end. I did the following check when I had students. Nowadays, I ask my students to do their exams with pen and paper. So there is no more internet in the classroom. That's over. And then I was actually sort of said, let me ask the same questions to this ordinary artificial intelligence. I'm not going to call the names, but ordinary stuff. Well, they gave me the answers, which are all correct. There was nothing in the answers that I found wrong per se, but it was pretty elementary. I would never give it an A. It was just kind of statements, but without any further development of that statement. So if I were to look at that, somebody to give me this, I would give him a B. B, maybe B minus, maybe B plus, but certainly not an A.
Yeah. I think it depends a lot on which model you use. And the basic versions will be not so great, little elementary. But when you get to more higher models and advanced levels, those actually give really PhD level answers. So the technology has quite changed over the years. That's my view.
So I will next time actually put the questions that I put to my students, I'll put it to that maybe advanced model, and maybe I can actually grade them according to what the advanced model says. It
Yeah,
would be
that'll be fun experiment. But on that note, thank you so much, Branko. It was really great chatting with you and hearing your views.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that we were able to connect, and it was a pleasure. Thank you. Hope to see you soon again.
Yes, thank you, Branko.
Bye bye.